Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan. And in this episode, I sat down with Dan Romito. Dan is a managing director at Pickering Energy Partners, where he oversees the consulting and advocacy practice. Dan is also the host of the Petronoia podcast, and this year he also published a book titled The Radical Middle, which focuses on how we figure out how to have balanced energy conversations. I've included links to both the podcast and the book in the show notes for people to check out. Dan focuses on capital markets and changing regulatory landscapes, and both of these form the basis for our conversation. We talk about how energy and climate policy is shifting both here in the US and overseas, particularly in terms of the loud conversation happening around how do we power AI. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel to stay on top of all upcoming episodes. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Dan. Hey everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon. Today I'm joined by Dan Romito. Dan, welcome. How are you?
Appreciate you having me. Thank you. I
Yeah.
love the pronunciation of my name with an Australian accent. It's pretty badass. Pretty cool.
Hopefully I didn't butcher it
No,
too
it's
bad.
perfect. It's better
I
than most
tend
people with a regular accent.
I tend to pronounce things a little bit funny, but that's okay from time to time, even though I've been in the US for quite a while. Um, no, super excited. We've got so much to talk about and things like that. Super exciting. I wanted to kick it off though. You recently published a book
Did.
called The Radical Middle. People should get a hold of it, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But talk about what was the motivation for it? You're out and about talking to people all the time, and so I'm really curious. Where was the gap? What did that? Just talk about that.
Yeah, so in consummate Pickering Energy Partners form. So if anyone that knows that Dan Pickering, he gets into the weeds on anything that's worthwhile. So we had naturally been just writing on a variety of energy related considerations. And so, in the last 4 years, I probably wrote, 30 or 40 different things about various energy topics. And where it really hit home was my son, who's now 14, but he was 12 at the time. He came home and he made a really interesting comment. He's like, Dad, I told everyone at school what you did or what you do, and it was oil and gas. He goes, why does everyone always lose their mind? It's literally what he said. He's like, why does everyone always lose their mind when it comes up? I'm like, well, they don't really have to. And he's like, well, why not? And so when I just started to explain to him, why you don't have to lose talking about this stuff, he goes, well, he was being kind of like a smart ass, but he was like, yo, you should write a book about it. And about a week later, this is a true story. I had a 4-hour layover. And it was one of those things where the airline cancels or delays your flight 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 minutes. And
You're
I'm
the
like, dude,
worst.
this sucks. So I'm literally at the bar and I'm 3 or 4 beers deep. And I'm like, I'm done watching Netflix. I have nothing to read and I'm bored out of my mind. And I just started putting together parts of the book and combining that with the stuff I had already written. And then out came, literally the book. So it was
Love that.
mostly a function of helping just people who are not any way, shape, or form in the energy space just realize that this doesn't have to be like a guns blazing debate, right? You can actually have a really constructive conversation if you stick to the facts and you remain intellectually honest in explaining the trade-offs on both sides of the renewables and the oil and gas spectrum.
I love that. And I think even even for folks that are in industry, I think I confuse a lot of people. I've got a petroleum engineering background, but I'm doing carbon and climate kind of things, but I still
Yeah.
work in oil and gas, and I still think we should be funding oil and gas and stuff, and it's so for even yeah, even people in industry, I think there's a lot on the flip side of that, right? Of well, how does renewables and how does that even fit into what we're doing? Is that and that I
Yeah,
assume
look, I would say the renewables crowd, generally speaking, and it's getting better, has been far louder on how awesome renewables are. But oil and gas, in my opinion, probably could have done a better job of actually explaining just how deep and how intricate and how dependent our overall, not only economy, but just lifestyle is. It's much better now than it was, 6, 7 years ago. But I was actually having this conversation with someone this morning. It's, not that the oil and gas community did this, but someone who's very pro oil and gas would usually just default to saying something along the lines of like, well, you're an idiot, or like, you don't get it. And it's like, well, if they don't get it, take the time to really explain it to them. I think one of the things that both sides actually need to improve upon is explaining things more in the context of trade-offs. Right, there is no silver bullet that magically solves, like, all the problems that we have. Like, any economic decision is going to have a set of benefits and a set of trade-offs, and you have to be intellectually honest and very objective with those trade-offs. And so, for natural gas and the oil industry, I moonlight as an adjunct professor at Marquette, and you have younger people typically who are more prone to say something along the lines of like, let's get rid of oil and gas. It's like, instead of yelling at them and being "Ugh," and like losing your mind, it's like, okay, fine, let's do that. But you can't have your phone, you can't have clothes, you can't have a car, you can't have roads, you can't have bridges, you can't have air conditioning, you can't have airplanes, you can't have all the stuff that you take for granted today. And they're like, well, what do you mean? And that's usually the first sort of like, tip that, well, maybe they haven't done their homework to the extent that they should. And it's not just students. I mean, older people are guilty of that as well. And then on the renewable side, it's something very similar. It's, well, we should just go all renewables. Okay. Like, but then they'll talk about how amazing like artificial intelligence and generative AI and data centers and hyperscaling is the future. And you're like, well, you can't really have both. And they're like, well, what do you mean? And
Yeah.
that's your tip off, like, okay, we sort of have to peel back that onion a little bit more. And so going back to the book, like what I really wanted to convey was like, if you think in the context of solutions, and you prioritize free market principles and you talk about the merits of economic principles as well, like it doesn't become that heated of a debate. It's actually really, really simple. Like you obviously need both. You need a little bit more gas than you do renewables, but there's certainly a place for the renewables. And as far as like the climate change thing goes, it doesn't become this existential apocalyptic end of days scenario. It's like, well, we actually have really cool capabilities and technologies where we can mitigate and adapt to whatever scenarios thrown our way.
Yeah. And I think it's so important. I mean, one of the things that you talked about that I think I agree, coming from oil and gas, I think we've done a very bad job in messaging, but I feel like some of the messaging that's been out there has also been quite condescending, which automatically turns people off as well. And so, the fact that you've got the book out there and talking to folks, because you are out talking to executives and boards all the time. So, like, as we kind of, think about that, like, what is top of mind for folks right now? Like, as you're out and chatting to people and stuff.
Yeah, I think there's three things, right? Top of mind is, I would say, everyone, regardless of their political affiliation or ideology, like if you're just a reasonable everyday person, there's a little bit of fatigue on the climate discussion. I think it's morphed from, okay, it's turned into like, well, what's the solution, as opposed to like, all right, we're gonna, the end of the world is coming in 12 years. It's like, let's talk about like pragmatic solutions. It's also, hey, we have this divergence between the direction that the United States is going and the direction that, let's say, like Europe, and even to a certain extent, I would say Southeast Asia, like developed economies in Southeast Asia. And I would probably throw in like a South Korea in there as well. And then just, what does the next 10 years look like? That's a big conversation that I'm having with a variety of boards. Is, for the first time in their career, you're really seeing this intersection or this convergence between infrastructure, technology, energy, and power. For the longest time, there was this confluence, I would say, where the power markets and the energy markets were sort of just, for whatever reason, combined. And what people are learning as the hyperscale economy begins to evolve a lot quicker than what it was 2, 3 years ago, is that power and infrastructure are a completely different animal than energy. And you can't necessarily fix the power markets if you don't fix the energy markets. And if you don't address the infrastructure markets, then whatever sort of conceptual plans you have for the power markets doesn't really put into place. And, it's like, even board members are like, wow, it's a lot more complicated than I thought. It's like, yeah, dude, you don't go down to Home Depot and get some copper and some asphalt and like, all right, we're good. There's our data center. It doesn't work that way. It's a little bit different in the tech industry. I lovingly refer to the technology sector as the tech bros. And here I'm the one wearing like the vest. I get it. Um, but Technology is still a little bit behind on their understanding, their full sort of A to Z understanding of how the energy ecosystem actually works. Like for the longest time, it was predominantly focused on generation, and so the other tenets of power, whether it was transmission or distribution, kind of got thrown to the side. And so when you had all these like cool data centers or data center developers talking about like, we will go off grid or we'll just do it organically. And you're like, well, at some point in time, you're going to be hooked up to the grid or you're going to be mandated or you're going to want
Yeah.
to, right? Because they're like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, if you're generating too much power, like don't go to waste. You can
Yeah. What are
sell
you
that.
gonna do with it? Yeah.
Yeah, you sell it. Like, and if you're not generating enough power, then you're going to need something. And they're like, oh yeah. And it's like, well, how are we going to do that? And it's like, once again, like this comes into like how power works, how infrastructure works, how transmission, distribution. And then you always get that comment. It's like, wow, it's a lot more complicated than I thought. And then don't even, I mean, let's not even take into account like eminent domain or states' rights or pipelines or like that stuff is so far down the road, permitting reform. Like we're not
Yeah.
even there yet. It's just the general understanding how just stuff works.
And it's, I mean, it's such a huge, whether it's gas infrastructure, power infrastructure, like the US is just so big, trying
Yeah.
to move all this stuff around and things like that
Right.
with so many people. Like, and I would agree, like coming from upstream oil and gas, like I don't know anything about power. Like, and it's, I mean, I'm learning bits and pieces quickly, but I mean, it's a completely different language. Like, it's not even so. Even as we talk about
A lot of
energy,
acronyms too. It's like all
oh my
this alphabet soup. It gets crazy really fast.
And so then even when you do layer on climate conversations, then you got a completely different set of acronyms and language
Yeah.
and people and all this kind of stuff as well. It's even just more and more I'm finding that I'm being a translator for folks around different bits and pieces as we've never really and I say we like industries haven't it's been a lot more segmented than it feels like it is now. We're having to figure out how to integrate like we never have before. Is that I don't know,
Yeah,
would
I mean,
you agree with
even
that?
like, wow, you trigger me. Like, I know I'll give you the abridged version because I this is something that I've been railing on for a while now. I actually think it's like a top down um problem that we have. In other words, like sector designation in terms of the capital markets, sector designation that we have in our equities market doesn't really reflect what we really have in terms of economic reality. Case in point, like Amazon is a consumer discretionary company. It's like, yes, I go on Amazon to buy stuff, but I will argue till I'm blue in the face that they're a tech company. You have sector designation that is disproportionately weighted towards industries that are dependent on other industries. So for example, the technology sector right now is like 35% of the overall S&P 500. There's 11 different sectors in the S&P 500 and, one of the 11 represent over a third. So there's a disproportion.
Yeah.
And I would make the argument that the dependencies, once again, there's like an investment thesis that says, well, you don't invest in the widget, you invest in the supply chain that facilitates the ability for the widget to be the widget. And so when you look at tech bros, there should be a greater representation of energy. There should be a greater representation of power. There should be a greater representation of infrastructure. And there just isn't.
Yeah.
Like we become overly quantitative, right? There's more quantitative traders in the market. So that sort of negates just critical thought. It's very, very, algorithmic, if you will. Index investing is way too much overrepresented. There is a place for index investing, but not to the extent that it is now because it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. I am an index. I receive inflows. I allocate them based on the sector weights. So I don't penalize underperformers and reward overperformers. I just replicate the index because it's the index.
And it's yeah.
So in other words, it's not a true representation. And why I think that becomes such an issue is that we just think it's just human nature to think that, oh, well, technology, because there's such a large representation of the market, must have figured it out. And then when you talk to them, they're like, no, dude, like we don't know. Given just the arms race that we are facing now, but will, last over the next decade, you know, it's not like we have the luxury of not beating China in the AI race. It's not like we don't have the luxury of just waiting around for infrastructure and water management and land oversight to get a little bit better. Like, we sort of have to act now. Like the consequences and the ramifications of not getting or not having our shit together. Like it doesn't result in like, we lose out on a little bit of return. It's like, no, we lose our economic standing in the global economy. We lose our militaristic positioning geopolitically. We lose our the probability of social mobility upward for our own citizens. Like there's real consequences in not in the stuff not getting done.
Yeah. And it's I mean, the US has gone all in on AI, and
Yeah.
then that also then means energy as well, and I think, yeah, your point, I can't remember who I heard say it, but it was like they talked about the sort of the difference with the US and China, where the US has gone all in on AI, whereas China's gone all in on power essentially in
Yeah.
terms of building out the supply chain for power, and it's almost like they're sort of different. They're interrelated, as you talked about, but they're very different
Yeah.
ways. Like, I don't know
The,
if you've got any thoughts on that?
No,
Sorry.
totally. Like I've talked about this extensively. Like I just gave a presentation to the American Foundries Society, right? Foundries are vital for any sort of capital intensive infrastructure project, particularly a data center. China just, I don't want to say they don't care, but in terms of like regulatory oversight, their perspective or mindset is like, we just got to get it done. How do we get it done? And our perspective is a little bit between China and Europe. Like Europe is like, I love rules. Rules are the best. Compliance is the way to go. It has to be compliance, 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 compliance. And we're a bureaucracy that we're just going to over paralyze ourselves on. And so you can probably tell where I stand on the European approach to things. But in the US, we just make stuff way too complicated. Like we become far too bureaucratic. And I know we're having this discussion of like, the point of regulation. Like the point of regulation, in my opinion, is to facilitate an efficiency with attaining realistic goals. That's the point of regulation, right? To put in a set of rules that doesn't disproportionately impact one group or over another in the pursuit of some sort of aspirational economic goal, right? And people are like, why economic? It's because if you don't have the economics in place, then you're not going to have the funds for anything societal or anything altruistic or anything, regarding anything philanthropic. So, like, why do I pick economics? Because it's a trickle down impact. So, like, nuclear would be the perfect example. Like, China is putting up nukes like it's going out of style. We are like, well, we need permitting reform and we need this all this other bullshit. Sorry, like stuff. No, it's a PG family program. Um, so it's just like it's just it's just we're getting in our own way and it's getting increasingly frustrated.
Well, the nuclear one is it is a classic one, right? Because people have been talking about nuclear being and I mean, Chris Wright's been out talking about the fact that nuclear is gonna be part of the solution, but it's like, it's gonna take 30 years to build it. It's like, okay, well, in what current reality is that even an option with
We don't have 30 years.
no,
No.
we
Yeah,
don't.
and I love the stuff that Chris is doing. He's making a lot of sense. Like if I'm speculating, not knowing anything insider, I'm guessing that behind closed doors is pulling his hair out just out of sheer frustration. It shouldn't We should be building nukes in 3 to 5 years, right? We should say, what are we trying to achieve? What are the consequences of not achieving it in the time frame that we want to? And that should be sort of like your risk analysis, right? Because the downside of not doing it in a timely fashion are so intense and so consequential that it's sort of a no-brainer. But once again, we get in our own ways, and perhaps that's the greatest frustration, right? Well, just because we've always done it like a certain way, and because we've always had these layers of bureaucracy in place, like, well, this is how we do it. It's like, no, like that's not the way it should do it. Like, let's kind of get our act together. There's so many other words I want to say, or I'll keep it PG.
No, you're
Uh,
fine.
but no, like, I mean, truly, like, I mean, let's be honest. Let's call it what it is. The government should get their head out of their ass and say, let's just get it done. How do we get it done? Instead, they were like, well, what about this? What about that? What about that? Like, no, like if you equate it to like a publicly traded company, like why are there companies like legacy companies that have been around for 100 years where their stock price hasn't moved in 5 or 6 years? It's because they analyze everything to the nth degree. And by the time they make a decision, it's too late. Right. And so it's just like, that's why entrepreneurship is so critical. It's because it's just a different mindset. Right. Oklo, great example. They're like, hey, we're entrepreneurs. We see a problem. We're going to fix it. Stock, now it's probably a little bit bubblish because it's appreciated so much, but it's a rocket ship. You have other companies, and I won't name any names, you just Google search it, and their stock prices like this. It's why? It's because they're littered with bureaucratic thinkers who aren't doers. And we need to eliminate that mindset from our government policy and facilitate a set of rules that allow the entrepreneurs and the problem solvers to just get stuff
To
done.
get stuff done. So thinking about that then, like in terms of the balance, you talked about Europe, you talked about China and stuff like that. Like I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like more and more energy policy is climate policy and climate policy is energy policy, and they're very linked, and like different governments have put the different emphasis on one. Like we create an energy policy, therefore that has climate impacts,
Yeah.
or we create a climate policy and therefore it has energy impacts. Like how do you how do you feel like that shift is kind of moving? Because I don't know, I definitely feel like there has been a shift back to just this whole energy conversation.
Yeah.
It feels like the New York Climate Week conversation was all about AI and power, which is
Yeah.
wild because it's like those things almost seem counterintuitive. But like, I don't know, like how do we balance those things? And like, do
I
you
definitely agree with you. Like there is this pendulum effect depending on who's in part in power. You have this back and forth. I will say this. I will say the Europeans are completely out of their mind. They've completely gone off the deep end. And for the UK in particular, to prioritize emissions when they make up 2% of global emissions and have done it at the expense of their economic output. Like what's ironic is they're going to run out of money and run out of capital facilitate technologies that help decarbonize. Like that's the irony in this stuff. So I think European leadership has been nothing short of terrible. I think it's borderline hilarious in sort of like the tragic sense of way. Like they need to overhaul everything. And you're sort of seeing this in practice, but not discussion, Germany. Like, let's go renewable. Oh, wait, it doesn't work. Let's decommission nuclear. Oh, wait, that was a dumb idea. Now we're burning coal. Like, I don't get it. Like, so anyway, like short-term gratification usually results in long-term consequences, like as the old cliche goes. Um, you know, Southeast Asia, you look at economies like South Korea, or you look at even, Singapore, or even like hints of Indonesia. Like Indonesia is, they're pretty smart about it. They're like, hey, we have to decarbonize, but our economy is 95% gas. So we have to just be smart about it. South Korea is pretty similar as well. It's like, hey, we are, for all intents and purposes, a economy fixated on technological innovation, right? You have the various companies there. They're like, yeah, we have to decarbonize, but we can't do it at the expense of our economy. And you see the United States come that way a little bit. What's fascinating to me is, the United States has been decarbonizing our economy and increasing GDP per capita since like 1975. Like this is not a new thing. We've been doing this before me and you were born. Um, I don't understand why the United States is sort of the focal point for anything emissions related as far as like a culprit would go. It's like, actually, guys, we have a pretty good blueprint. Certainly room for improvement. Certainly always room for innovative technology. Certainly we have to adapt to, different things like the bridge from natural gas to nuclear over time. But, sitting around arguing and yelling at like just stuff that doesn't matter, the whole kick in the pants is we've been doing this already and we've decreased our emissions. So what's the problem? Like that's the one part I don't get. Like just you could spend, instead of hiring me, you could spend 15 minutes on Google or ChatGPT or Wikipedia, look at a couple graphs, and you're like, actually, it's not that bad.
yeah, like it has I mean, we are still the largest or one of the largest emitters in the world, but you do see those downward trends, with
Yeah, I mean,
emissions and
so
stuff.
you're right. We are the largest emitter, one of the largest emitters, but I tend to look to normalize that. Like, I don't think you can look at it from an absolute perspective. It's a function of what your economy is doing. And I'm not arguing with you. I'm just saying we get that a lot. But, when you normalize the numbers and you actually look at it on an efficiency ratio, um, we've always been improving since,
Yeah.
like I said, 75,
Mhm.
76.
Do you think, we talked about sort of the pendulums with policy and stuff like that. I I think the EPA endangerment finding stuff and bringing some of the coal plants back on is purely sort of an acknowledgement that we need more power and we need it from
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, or do you think that, like, then some of the funding for some of the renewable projects and stuff that's being pulled and all that kind of stuff, like, do you think we have the risk of going too far then and taking
Um,
away, or like, how, I don't know, how do we
I
find the
don't think so. I think Trump in particular looks at the world in a very binary fashion. He's like, what is the goal? How do we get there? Right? If the goal is to improve economic output, which that's the goal, then the question becomes, well, how do we get there in the most efficient manner possible? Efficiency being measured by cost and speed. A renewable project, I don't care what anybody says, is losing money. It loses money more times than not. I'm sure there's exceptions. But back to your coal point, like I've heard this argument before that, you know, and I don't want to sound like an apologist for the Trump administration, but I don't think Donald Trump sits around figuring out ways to destroy the economy. He probably looks at the world very reasonably and says, how much power is going to be required to build this AI economy? Okay. Where are we at? Okay, we have this gap. How do we fill that gap in the quickest and most efficient way possible? Now, I would make the argument that just as our economy did the transition from coal to natural gas, coal is probably a short term band aid, or at the very least should be considered a short term band aid. But it doesn't make sense to build a renewable facility and then it doesn't provide the results that were needed, that were known in the first place to power this massive increase in power demand that we're about to experience. And oh, by the way, American coal is far cleaner, far more efficient, a lot safer than Chinese coal. So, in other words, all treated the same. So, like, very long winded answer to your question is, do I think the EPA looks at the world through the context of economic goals, and I would imagine that they're looking at economic goal or prioritizing economic goals because of the trickle down impact regarding standard of living, social mobility upwards, etc. Um, and then saying, well, what do we have to do to facilitate those goals or the path to those goals without disproportionately impacting anyone else. Like what drives me nuts is, we have millions of abandoned wells in the United States. I don't see people who are so focused on like emissions management spending more time on plugging abandoned wells. I see them making the case for more renewables. Doesn't make any sense to me, right? Fix the problem at hand. And then once you fix the problem at hand, then move on, right? If you have a hole in your roof, you don't redo the kitchen, fix the hole in the roof. Then
Oh,
you take the
yeah.
question.
And we could talk about the orphan well stuff. I've been spending quite a lot of time on that. But before I want to stay on uh, the tech kind of like trying
Sure.
to reconcile the AI kind of piece, because I know you and I were at an event recently and you talked about how, like a lot of the big, again, tech companies,
Yeah.
Amazon or Meta
The tech
now,
bros.
all those guys, like, they've made public commitments around
Sure.
their decarbonization, but they're also trying to figure out their own power
Yeah.
needs, some of that kind of stuff. Like, sort of in that same kind of vein around, the reconciliation of that for themselves. Like, talk about kind of what you're seeing in that space where it's like, it is gonna be hard for them to do both potentially. Like, but
Yeah. I
there
mean,
is
I'll preface
challenges
it with
there.
this. Like what I really appreciated about the oil and gas community, because it's very prevalent in the technology community. I'm not saying other sectors don't have this, but generally speaking, in oil and gas and technology, when they see a problem, the focus is on like how to solve the problem, not freaking out about it. Like I'm sure behind closed doors, they're like, my it's like when something pops up, it's like, oh my God, like, and not again. And this, I can't believe I'm dealing with this bullshit. But like one thing about oil and gas is like, well, you have to be a problem solver because the stakes are so high. Right. And then technology, like that's just their mindset, like figuring out how to make really complex stuff work. Um, you know, when, right before COVID, every technology company, for the most part, with the exception of Elon was like, we're going net zero. And even at that time, it sounded a little bit ridiculous. It's like, how are you going net zero? Like, you guys rely by definition on power. I can't use my iPhone, my laptop, my remarkable tablet, my
Whatever it
anything
is.
without plugging it in. Like, it's got to be charged. Anyway, that's besides the point. So like 2019, 2020, whatever it was, we're like, we're going net zero. Then everyone figures out that you can make really cool illustrations in Chat GPT. That's like 2022. It catches on like wildfire, and the emissions profile of tech bros go up. Do I think it's the end of the world? No, because we're already seeing really innovative, cool technologies emerge, like carbon credits, whether it's regulatory or voluntary. It should be voluntary for a variety of reasons. We'll cover that later. But carbon credits, you're looking at increased technologies that are in its relative infancy, but theoretically, if done the right way, like DAC, like really expensive, really hard to scale, they'll figure it out. It's a total cliche. It's a little bit corny, but it's like, look, dude, if we figured out how to land on the moon, I don't think it's going to be that hard to figure out like how to lower increased emissions. Like, I just don't think this is the daunting problem of our day. There's so many other things that are sort of environmental adjacent or directly environmental. Like, I think the state of water in or stewardship in the United States is abysmal. I think our infrastructure is crumbling. I even think our land management isn't great, right? We're not optimizing our land potential the way that we should be. We're certainly not being as good a stewards as we could be. So it's not to say like it's a, going to remain that way, but to go back to emissions, like, I just don't view it as like this existential threat. Like, if emissions even got bad, which they're not, um, would me and you be able to like live our life the way that we are today for a long time? Probably. Like, I live in Florida. There's a hurricane that blows through Florida. Day 3, man, if there's no electricity, that becomes the purge. You have the old timers on their porch with their gun, and they're like, if you rob my house, I will shoot you. And that's on day 3 with no running water. So imagine like if we don't get our act together on a broader scale with water management or land management.
Yeah. No, and I think I'm hearing more and more in the climate conversation, and I know it's starting to come up on the AI side. The water conversation is loud. And again, coming from Australia, where I think I've been living in drought my whole life between Australia and now Colorado, it's like,
Just
I
have
don't
no
know,
luck in the drought side.
whoops.
Yeah.
But like it is something that is starting to get a lot more attention.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
I
which
agree.
I
Yeah.
don't think is a bad thing. Like we shouldn't like
It depends.
yeah.
It depends who's controlling the narrative, right? I don't want to see Greta Thunberg and her weird haircut talk anymore. I don't want to hear or AOC talk about whatever she talks about. I don't want to hear. You know who I do want to hear? I want to hear from Judith Curry, right?
Who's
I
Judith
want to.
Curry? I don't know who
Judith
Judith Curry
Curry
is.
was the woman who wrote sort of the rebuttal to the existing climate science. She was actually ostracized as like a loon because of her stance. And when you actually talk to her, like, look, I'm not going to, I think she lives in Arizona. I'm not going out to Arizona to like, go hunt or hang out with her, but you have to listen to like the detail she puts in her analysis. She doesn't say that there isn't a climate thing going on, right? She acknowledges climate change, but she makes the point of like, there's a finite amount of money and maybe investing in technologies that we know don't work, or at least provide what we need them to provide to the extent we need them. Maybe allocating capital to like adaptation or decarbonization or just in a different way should be better. She makes the example, like, one of the examples that she gives is like, hey, San Francisco's airport is sinking, and climate nuts are like, well, that's because of climate change. And she's like, actually, that airport, that land has been sinking since the 20s, right? It sinks, like land sinks. Shorelines, they're rising, right? And us going net zero will not stop that, which I actually think she's correct. I don't think instituting a net zero economy in the United States where emissions is 13% of the global total will solve the global emissions problem. So a better use of time and capital and no pun intended energy would be like, how do we figure out how to mitigate this stuff? And how do we figure out how to adapt to what we think the world is going to look like in 50, 60, 100 years, whatever it may be? And it doesn't, you don't have to be neurotic or crazy about it. It's like, yeah, something's going on. Like, doesn't sound awesome. Better figure it out. Like, we can figure that out. Pretty
Yeah.
smart.
But it also brings up the efficient, the efficient use of capital is a big one. And then something that I've been talking about, and it was off the back of an article that Tisha Schuler wrote of like, instead of an all of the above energy, it's like how do we do best of the above? You talked about land use and stuff like that. It's sort of just part of that conversation. Like how do we create systems that work
Yeah.
for that local environment and
I
local
should have taken
environment
a horse
being
tranquilizer before we had this. Like, here I go. Like, just, you know, I think the lazy answer to your question is the government will figure out. Like,
no, they won't. The government's not gonna
it is
figure anything out.
such a lazy default answer. Like, the government sucks. They're terrible at everything. And like, the last thing that I want to do is to give the government more power on that will result in greater inefficiency. Like, we have to acknowledge that you cannot tax your way into solutions and you can't tax your way into prosperity. It does not work by definition. It's taking money out of the system. And we're already at least in the States, but this is pretty prevalent with other, let's call it westernized economies. Debt's too high. Cost of living is way too high. And instead of like bickering about, well, who's going to pay for this? It's like, put in a system that rewards people who provide solutions. Like, it used to be a joke, but I'm dead serious about this. Like, if the government was serious about decarbonizing, they would tell the companies, the first one that figures out how to decarbonize and can prove it and verify it and all these other like mechanisms to ensure that it's 100% on, you never have to pay taxes again. You don't think Exxon would figure that out? Like, everyone would figure it out. But once again, it's like we always think that it's the stick and overregulation that is going to bear the results that we want. I'm not saying you don't have regulation in place. You have pragmatic regulation, but there has to be a lot more carrots instituted from an economic perspective to change behavior. Cause that's a lot about like what people are doing. Like, once again, if sea levels are rising, empirically they are, why the hell is 750 people a day moving to Florida? Why do celebrities have beachfront houses and not moving to like Nebraska? Like, why are all these things in place? Well, it's because of behavior. So if you want to change the way that you are, people are not going to respond to being beaten over the head with rhetoric and stupid rules. They will change their behavior if they're financially incentivized to do it in a responsible manner.
Yeah. And I've said this for years where it doesn't matter if it's a country or company or like you and me, with our family decisions, people make decisions for economic reasons. Like,
Percent.
and so it's again figuring out the market mechanisms from a decarbonization point of view that
Yeah.
then make, because we can't just regulate companies out of business because then like that's a losing
That's how we
strategy.
got the abandoned well problem in the first place. Like, the
Yeah.
vast majority of these abandoned wells were the result of bankruptcies
Yeah.
because of overregulation and fines. Now, once again, I'm not saying that there were not players that totally warranted a fine. There had to have been. But when you make it disproportionately unfair and the economics don't work, there's consequences to that. And on the other point too, we always, when we say the government, the default is the federal government. Federal government outside of the military, like I said, sucks at everything. This should be a local government consideration. What makes sense in West Texas probably doesn't make sense in New York City. Like, what makes sense in New York City probably doesn't make sense in, I don't know, insert company or
Yeah.
city, Oregon.
Colorado, like wherever,
Right, Oregon.
like yeah. It's
And
all
like, when we also have to stop listening to California. Like, California is the example of how not to do anything. And they're going to pay the price in such extreme ways, right? With Valero, their only refinery leaving Southern California. Like, it's just going to get to a place where everyone who can afford to leave is going to leave, leaving the burden on the people who can least afford it. And then there is no tax revenue. And that's the great irony of this is like, oh, like, we'll just tax our way in. It's like, it doesn't work like that. At some point, whoever can leave will leave. And then whoever stays can't afford it in the first place. And then where does your revenue come from?
yeah. No, and particularly with the businesses also leaving California.
Right.
Chevron being one of the larger examples, they've shifted their headquarters to Houston,
Yeah.
to get around
Yeah.
some of the climate reporting. So,
Or just a better tax,
yeah,
better business
taxes and climate
environment. I would
reporting.
even make the argument. I think the climate thing was probably like just, like an added bonus. I think Chevron looked at, you know, constant attempts to like, hey, can we improve the business atmosphere in the state? And Newsom, for all intents and purposes, is a complete idiot and said no. And they're like, well, we have no other choice.
Yep,
Bye.
yep,
Vote with your feet.
yep. Dan, we could probably keep chatting for like an hour, probably two. But like, I'm really curious as we kind of get close to wrapping up. What are you, as you're like going and talking to folks, and I know you're
Yeah.
at an event this week and stuff like that. Like, what's on your radar? Like, what are you kind of like looking out for in terms of like what's coming down the pipeline?
I really want to see how the nuclear sector or industry matures over the next year. I think the next 12 months for the nuclear industry is critical. Like that's going to be a really telling scenario for what the next 5, 10,
Yeah,
even probably 15 years looks like. Hopefully it gets a little bit better. I think the carbon credit market is going to explode. I don't see any other scenario where it does not. You have the vast majority of global companies, large global companies, have some sort of environmental or emissions related goal. No one, maybe a few, but let's just say 95% of them are not going to attain that goal. They raised capital saying they're going to get that goal. They marketed that they made that goal. There's a lot of reputational equity at stake. And I would say the third thing is I'm really curious to see um, how the energy narrative evolves, right? I don't want it to like completely negate and eliminate climate considerations. Like I think there's a place for that. But it'd be really interesting to see sort of like where the new quote unquote middle lands.
how does that
Hopefully
sound?
it's on something super pragmatic and something more results oriented. Hopefully it's much more founded on free market principles and sound economics as opposed to just sort of neuroticism and ideology. Um, I do see it's very interesting. Like 3 years ago, we have to go renewable. Then it was best of all of the above. And then today it's like, what's the best of all the above? There will be some cool technology, whether it's SMR or some sort of infrastructure or some sort of scaling capability, like everyone's trying to figure out, and people think it's SMRs. Like it would be really, really interesting to see how that evolves in the next 12 months as well.
Yeah, no, it's gonna be really interesting. And I think you and I are aligned on some of the things. I think the energy conversation for me is huge. And I think, we didn't actually go back to the orphan well credits and stuff, but the thing that's really interesting for me is the narrative around those. It's an easy win in terms of methane reduction and avoidance, but because they're like almost stigmatized because they're associated with the oil and gas industry, people don't like them. So it's like it's sort of this like evolution of like, okay, how do we think about energy? How do we think about some of the easy wins
Yeah.
and some of that kind of stuff
It's
and
the
where is
most
that gonna
irritating
land?
conversation. Just sorry, like humor
No,
me for
it's
like
but it's
30
like
seconds. Like,
yeah,
like I know there's certain, and I won't name names, there's certain environmental NGOs that are so full of shit because you go to them and you're like, hey, I can eliminate 300,000 tons of leaking methane. And they're like, oh my God, tell me more. And you're like, we can plug abandoned wells. And you're like, well, we have a hard time with helping the oil and gas industry. It's like, well, which one do you want? Do you want to penalize the oil and gas industry for the perceived sins of our fathers? Or do you want to eliminate the problem? Like, which one do you want? And to be honest
yeah,
with you, they just want to penalize the oil and gas industry. Not all of them. Most of them are actually really, really cool. There's a certain select few where, like, again, I had to get off the phone, immediately go downstairs. If I had a tranquilizer, I would have done it, but take a long, long walk because they're full of crap. Like you're not focused on like methane. You have this hero complex where you want to just penalize oil and gas because the oil and gas. And granted, they're no angels, but don't position yourself as like we're results oriented and we're trying to fix the problem.
yeah.
No, bullshit.
No, exactly. And to be honest, that's why this is so important. So, 'cause
I can assure you that in the book, I think there's only one curse word. Uh,
But it is, I mean, it's like you said, there is some solutions out there that could really move the needle, but the narrative and the story around that is really challenging. And so, it's been really great to chat. And I think it's, yeah, like I said, it's cool that you're helping with the
yeah,
narrative as we try and figure this all out. So, Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure.
thank you so much
As
for the
always,
time. This is great. I won't
cool.
drink as much coffee before the next podcast we
You and
do
me
it.
both. So
All right.
it'll be great. Thanks.
Thank you.